Well, hello again. Welcome to the Hammer Museum. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to tonight's talk by David Rhodes. There are many of us here on staff and many of our regular visitors who would gladly spend our days listening to David Rhodes speak on any subject. But to see how he mixes together art and literature and the history and culture of the time is really extraordinary. David Rhodes has a PhD from Stanford University, and he's taught Shakespeare and Restoration comedy for over 40 years in the English department at UCLA. He received a UCLA Distinguished Teaching Award as well as a Chevalier from the French government. For 15 years, he was also the director of the Grunwald Center for the Graphic Arts, although David wants me to say that the current director, Cindy Burlingham, did all the work. And although he's now officially retired, David still teaches courses in English and in theater arts and still keeps an office at the Hammer Museum because, as he said, who wouldn't want to be at the most exciting place in town? So without further ado, please join me in offering a very, very warm welcome to David Rhodes.
I suppose the common theme of this evening is heads on platters. And you can, if you wish, buy a custom-made scimitar for the season at the Hammer Museum gift shop. And I know who I would like for you to use it upon. The glowing image you see on the screen and the subject of the elegant exhibition that Cindy Burlingham has organized upstairs is Salome dancing before the throne of King Herod. It was completed by Gustave Moreau, as Claudia said, in 1876. For me, it is Gustave Moreau's most compelling, iconic, and sensual work, and one of Dr. Armand Hammer's most imaginative purchases. He bought it at Park Bernay from Huntington, Hartford in 1973 for $95,000. In the same year, he bought the much larger and duller King David from Walter Chrysler for $100,000. The opulent music you were hearing after the vice presidential debate comes from the opening of Herodiade, the 1881 opera in 4 acts and 7 tableaux by Gustave Moreau's friend Jules Massenet. On Sunday, November 18th, in conjunction with the UCLA Department of Music, we're going to explore further this first musical response to Moreau's sensuous painting, along with Richard Strauss's later, more famous opera, as well as 2 delicious film responses, one by Alla Nazimova and one with Rita Hayworth. Even earlier, this compelling painting had attracted an even more famous friend of the painter to respond in aesthetic kind when Gustave Flaubert wrote his 3-part novella Herodiade in 1877, just 1 year after Moreau had finished his 7-year labor on his own creation. And like Massenet, Flaubert chose to focus upon the maternal playwright of this lurid political tragedy, Salome's scheming, twice-wed mother. Both Flaubert and Massenet, in differing ways, go out of their way to protect the glistening Princess Salome from any involvement or moral recrimination in the murder of John the Baptist. We cannot, of course, know for sure what is in the mind of Moreau's lovely dancing princess, but we do know what this prim bachelor painter thought of women in general, not good. And we certainly know how Oscar Wilde, who came to Paris to admire the painting in Moreau's studio, would psychologize and eroticize this most famous dance in history in his famous subsequent melodrama. And for me, as a teacher of English theater history, the painting's provocative interest is intensified in that it served for Wilde's Salome, which he wrote in the early 1890s with Sarah Bernhardt, his friend, and the most famous actress in the world. One might argue the most famous actress who's ever lived as the title character. In turn, their celebrated fin de siècle collaboration has had fascinating 20th and 21st century reverberations. So my talk tonight comes in 4 segments, all set at the end of the 19th century. The painter and the painting, the playwright, the actress, and the play, followed by several very brief 20th and 21st century codas. The painter and the painting. Gustave Moreau was born in Paris in 1826. His father was an architect and a sophisticated bibliophile, and we can see his influence in Moreau's work, his wide culture, the importance of elaborate architectural settings in his work. This knowledge and the interest were intensified by the exotic styles featured in the Universal Paris Exposition of 1867. It's almost as if we were at the Isabel Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. Having twice failed to get a prize, the Prix de Rome, at the École des Beaux-Arts, Moreau eventually succeeded as a painter, at least among a coterie of avid aristocratic Parisian collectors. He moved meekly in the elegant salons of Paris, but he had very few public exhibitions, and he refused to show his work in public for the 7 years in which he worked on this painting. And as Claudia suggested, and as the exhibition that Cindy has so brilliantly organized shows, he made over 80 preparatory studies for this painting. Moreau died in 1898, having taught for the last 8 years of his life at the École des Beaux-Arts, and among his students were, as one could well see, an artist like Odilon Redon, but also Matisse was a student of his, as well as Georges Rouault. He left the house where he had lived his entire life with his widowed mother to the city of Paris, and it became his museum, and it was opened in 1902, and the first curator was his student, Georges Rouault. These are some of the photographs of the museum. The painting, which was finished in 1876, and as Claudia suggested, was exhibited and created, as one can well imagine, a sensation. It's the story of the daughter of Herodias dancing before her uncle's stepfather, King Herod, for the head of John the Baptist. It derives from 2 passages in the New Testament Gospels of Matthew and Luke, though in neither gospel is she actually named. Her name comes down to us from discarded material. She dances at the behest of her mother, who wants to silence John the Baptist for railing against her incestuous mother, who is her new marriage is to the brother of her previous husband, to Herod Antiochus. She's previously been married to his brother Herod Philippus. And it actually is probable that her new husband did the deed. Salome had long been the subject of artists, particularly artists such as Dürer, Rembrandt, Rubens, Ghirlandaio. She was a particular favorite of Mannerists who loved to work out the connection between innocence and decadence. Here's a picture by Carlo Dolce, what do I have on this plate? Looking rather surprised. But Moreau's 19th century, late 19th century painting is surely the most exciting, erotic, psychologically intriguing of all the studies that I know. He gives his glowing, levitating teenage Salome the most exciting sense. She holds a lotus flower, the ancient symbol of Indian art, a kind of pantheistic sense. Her other emblem is the sleek black panther who in the painting itself lies in foreground over to the far right side, whose breath was thought to lure men and beasts to their death with its perfumed sweetness, a kind of erotic halitosis. Moreau gives Salome a kind of incandescence. She lives in her own dreamlike foreground, while behind and above her in a shadow we see the enthroned King Herod. And if you go up to the exhibition, one of the most exciting things is how, first of all, in the sketches, Moreau builds his characters and gives them in the sketches. It's almost the reverse of what you might imagine. He gives in the sketches his characters firmness, and then in the painting lets them melt into shame. And he gives them an armature, and then they dissolve as they live in the painting. We see the enthroned Herod both remote and decayed, with the conspiring mother, who's the playwright of the action, deep over to the left in shadows. A masked executioner is then on the other side of the painting with a gleaming scimitar projecting forward the action to its inevitable climax, which we don't see, though the Oscar Wilde play, of course, will dramatize part of that action. It's 19th century Orientalism run amok. And in the presence of the painting, and in the vault gallery in particular, we feel a kind of claustrophobia. We can almost smell the lilies. Above Herod hangs the many-breasted figure of Diana of Ephesus, goddess of fertility. But of course, we're in a world that is ostentatiously infertile. As well as two representations of the Persian god Mithras, all connected in this to a world of paganism and Orientalism, and linking Salome symbolically to a pagan Sibyl and a primal temptress, who in Moreau's prim bachelor words, which he wrote about women in general, that's why I said not good earlier, are the ultimate cause of sin and every crime. You see why he stayed in that house with Mama. As one critic notes, Moreau's picture serves as, quote, a reliquary, architectonic, rigid, and richly decorated, and I might add, a reliquary that encapsulates and conveys to us an ancient nightmare world of sensual female treachery. Knowing that we all know how the old story ends, Moreau has chosen to picture his moonbeamed, childlike Salome just before her plunge into lust, madness, and execution. And in doing so, he catches and immortalizes that exquisite pederastic moment just before innocence turns to putrefaction. Now, Oscar Wilde, on the other hand, will dramatize and wallow in putrefaction, because Oscar Wilde always goes too far. It could be his motto. And it's partly why we love him and partly why he got into such very, very bad trouble. Moreau's painting stands exactly at the intersection of two powerful aesthetic movements of the late 19th century, art for art's sake and decadence. Of this painting, Moreau wrote, and it could be a motto for art's sake itself, "O noble poésie du silence, vivant et passionné, c'est la langue de Dieu." O noble poesy of divine silence, living and passionate, it is the language of God himself. And perhaps the most famous poet of this movement was Moreau's contemporary, Mallarmé, who famously wrote a poem on the subject of Salome. Likewise, decadence, which is exemplified perfectly by this painting and by the play that Wilde wrote, and which derived, I think, directly from two brilliant 18th century novelists, Leclos in his Liaison Dangereuse, and the intricate psychological meanderings of the Marquis de Sade, led directly to these two works on Salome, Moreau's and Wilde's. And this painting itself is described brilliantly in one of the great decadent novels of the late 19th century, Against Nature, or Against the Grain, Ribot, by Huysmans. And this is what he says: Moreau's Salome is not just a dancing girl, but the symbolic incarnation of undying lust, the goddess of immortal hysteria, the accursed beauty exalted above all other beauties by the catalepsy that hardens her flesh and steels her muscles, the monstrous beast, indifferent, irresponsible, insensible, poisoning, like the Helen of ancient myth, everything she touches. Wouldn't you like to be able to use words like catalepsy? In other words, these movements, art for art's sake and decadence, are really spectacularly synesthesiads, using all the senses and fusing them. And Oscar Wilde was simply in heaven when he came to Paris and saw this painting. Oscar Wilde's life and career are simply too famous to need reiteration. He was born in Dublin in 1854 of a staid Irish lawyer and a revolutionary, self-dramatizing mother. He died in exile in France in November the 30th, 1900, at the age of 46, and his grandson often comes to Los Angeles to work at the William Andrews Clark Memorial Library, which is owned by UCLA. And to just look at Oscar Wilde's grandson is itself a miracle. By the time his play, which he wrote in the early 1890s for the divine Sarah Bernhardt, was actually produced in Paris, he was serving a term for sodomy in an English prison, working on a treadmill. But in earlier, happier times, we see him with his poisonous young boyfriend, Lord Alfred Douglas, Bosie. In the Paris where he went after he was released from prison, he struck up a characteristically disastrous friendship, a flirtation even, with the glamorous, morally dubious, the next slide if you will, he looks morally dubious, doesn't he? Commandant Ferdinand Welsen Esterhazy, the aristocratic officer who had actually stolen the military secrets for which Dreyfus was serving a term in Devil's Island. And as many of you know, many of the same people who had supported Oscar Wilde in his tribulations in England were also passionate supporters of Dreyfus in his wrongful trial, military trial in France. But with ill-placed bravado, Wilde wrote to one of these mutual long-time supporters this: Esterhazy, i.e. my boyfriend, is considerably more interesting than Dreyfus, who is innocent. Everybody by this time knew that. It is always a mistake to be innocent. To be criminal takes imagination and courage. One wants to wring Oscar's neck at times. And it would indeed be very interesting to speculate on and contrast these two great trials of the century. The Wilde trials in England, which were about sex, and the great Dreyfus trial, which was about politics and anti-Semitic. Very French. But that's another story, and Wilde characteristically has an epigram to cover it. A patriot put in prison still loves his country, and a poet in prison for loving boys still loves boys. Wilde had been brilliantly educated in the classics at Trinity College, Dublin, and Magdalen College, Oxford, where he was awarded the coveted Newdigate Prize, even though he was often not in Oxford. Unfortunately, his learning and his yearning to be a celebrity and a professional sensationalist far outweighed his good judgment. He didn't have any good judgment to be outweighed, or his choice of boyfriends. He wrote criticism, poetry, a novel, political and philosophical treatises and plays, including Lady Windermere's Fan, An Ideal Husband, and in 1895, at the apogee of his fame, his last play, and really the greatest English comedy between The Way of the World and the Future, The Importance of Being Earnest, a trivial comedy for serious people. But his real talents reveal themselves in the ostentatious and precarious art of self-promotion and in his wonderfully economical and contradictory epigrams, and I'll give you a few. The only way to atone for being occasionally a little overdressed is by being always absolutely overeducated. A true friend stabs you in the front. The truth is rarely pure and never simple. The world is a stage, but the play is badly cast. I sometimes think that God, in creating man, somewhat overestimated his ability. There are only two tragedies in life. One is getting what one wants. The other is... no, sorry, I messed that one up. There are only two tragedies in life. One is not getting what one wants. The other is getting it. Education is an admirable thing, and this should be carved over the gates of every university. Education is an admirable thing, but it is well to remember from time to time that nothing that is worth knowing can be taught. Wilde had long been obsessed by transgressive history of Salome. After all, as a Uranian, transgression was his secret practice. And he knew well the contemporary poetic and novelistic versions by Mallarmé and Huysmans. He was fascinated by this Moreau painting, which he saw in Moreau's studio. Her lust must needs be infinite, and her perversity, without limits, her pearls must expire on her flesh. And he was determined to write the play for Sarah Bernhardt and have her dance naked on stage before some King Herod. But by the time Salome finally premiered, rather unsuccessfully, I'm sorry to report, in Paris in 1896, Oscar was in prison for sodomy, and Sarah, now 51 years old, was discreetly veiled in an elaborate Byzantine robe and a golden headpiece, looking, I would imagine, rather more like a stolid Birgit Nielsen in Turandot or an aging Theda Bara in a loose Sultan's cinematic seraglio than Moreau's sort of shimmering virgin princess. Sarah Bernhardt. The portrait of Sarah Bernhardt here is also in the Hammer collection by the well-born Belgian artist Alfred Stevens. It conveys beautifully Sarah's incandescent loveliness and her innate ability to create a sense of intimacy with the artist and with the viewer. She was born in Paris in 1944, the illegitimate daughter of a Jewish courtesan. That's a polite way of saying what her mother was. She was baptized a Catholic, educated in convent schools. She was the lover of almost everyone, women as well as men, including the Prince of Wales, Charles Haas, who was one of Proust's models for Charles Swann, Gustave Doré, and probably the society gynecologist, Dr. Pozzi. Let's hope she was, because he's also in the Hammer collection. She was surely the most famous stage actress who has ever lived. Her funeral in 1923 was the grandest in Paris since 1885, when her lover, her principal lover and favorite playwright, Victor Hugo, had died. She was slender and only 5'3", but everybody thought of her as tall and serpentine. Her great leap to prominence had come as a young actress in two great Victor Hugo plays, as the Queen of Spain in Ruy Blas and as Doña Sol in his Hernani. Proust celebrates her in À la recherche du temps perdu as La Belle-Mare, the great interpreter of Racine, and I think the next slide shows her as Phèdre, though it might as well show her as Salome. When young Marcel yearns to see her on stage, in Proust's words, her theatrical poses melted into a sort of radiance. In her 62-year career, she performed in over 125 plays, particularly celebrated in the dramas of Racine, Hugo, Rostand, Dumas Fils, and Sardou. She toured America 9 times for a total of 8 years in America. When you came, you stayed. She had dinner with Thomas Edison in his New Jersey home. She performed in circus tents. She performed on the pier in Venice, California, that is. She made a 1910 sound recording, which you can hear on YouTube. She played the young son of Napoleon in L'Aiglon when she was 66 years old. She was the first public celebrity probably to figure out that you could sell postcards and posters at the box office to make money, and she even promoted things like toothpaste, the only dentifrice of international reputation. This is Charles Mouchat's great poster of her, which you could buy at the theater if you went to see her and had enough money to do so. Testimony without end. D.H. Lawrence said, Oh, to see her and to hear her, a wild creature, a gazelle with a beautiful panther's fascination and fury, sobbing and sighing like a deer sobs, wounded to death, and all the time with the sheen of silk, the glitter of diamonds. And the young John Gielgud seeing her in Nottingham. In French, he didn't understand a word of it. I was bowled over. And the little withered gnome, Alice B. Toklas, who was Gertrude Stein's companion, recalls seeing her playing Phaedra, one of her signature roles, at the Greek Amphitheater outdoors in Berkeley. This in 1906, just after the great San Francisco earthquake, when much of San Francisco had been destroyed, including the Toklas' own Oakland house. And this is what Alice Toklas, no fool, no pushover, said. Evidently, Bernhardt had had no rehearsals, nor had she studied the large stage. Her arms outstretched, with her piercing cry, she backed forever toward the curtained door. She prolonged the cry. The golden voice continued. The audience was breathless. Finally, she reached the curtain and disappeared. I had seen her in many of her poignant roles, but was never more moved than this. In other words, in a single, desperate, improvised gesture and vocal continuo, the divine Sarah encapsulated not only Phaedra's tragic Greek-French anguish, but the entire apocalypse of the San Francisco earthquake. And the boys of Berkeley, there were no co-eds in 1906, were so moved that they unhitched the horses from her carriage and carried her carriage all the way to the ferry. And Toklas had a very good look at the 62-year-old actress. She fearlessly faced the California sun, her head thrown back with her famous radiant smile. I noticed, however, her visibly large teeth. Panther indeed. Toothpaste, too. Now, there were naysayers. Chekhov despised her. Ibsen, too. And George Bernard Shaw would have none of her. He preferred the younger, more psychologically intuitive and disappearing Eleonora Duse. But there were still lots and lots and lots of Sarah Bernhardt fans, and we'll let Sarah have the final words, remembering that her motto was the philosophical quand même, no matter what, or through it all, or whatever. Sarah said in her memoirs, life begets life, energy creates energy. It is by spending oneself that one becomes rich. Legend remains victorious in spite of history. While sensationalist play, and Michael Hackett is going to produce a dramatic reading here on the 5th or 6th of December, 5th of December at 7:30 p.m., which will be as sensationalist as they come. I'm trying out for the role of Herodias myself. Epitomizes, perhaps even more than the painting, the aesthetic of decadence and art for art's sake. Perhaps to me, if not to Michael, it no longer seems a very serious play, a little dated, a little overripe, a vehicle for a daring ingenue grown old. Though I want to make it clear that the new 51 is 71, or maybe even 81. I know my demographics. Before quoting the final moment of Wilde's tragedy, I want to speculate on the efficacy of a 51-year-old actress, however great, however famous, impersonating a murderous, veil-dropping child belly dancer. Richard Strauss, who in 1905 would use Wilde's play as the libretto for his sizzling, redemptive, operatic version, defines astutely the problem of what he identifies as the two Salomes. He acknowledged to a friend that what he really needed for the central role in his demanding opera version was a 16-year-old girl who could dance the part, but could also sing a soprano role as demanding as Wagner's monumental Isolde. However mythic and age-defying an actress, Sarah Bernhardt at 51 was far more Wagnerian than nymphatic. But give your particular attention to the lighting directions that the astute Wilde provides. Torchlight, moonlight, starlight, darkness, and a moonbeam. Exactly what I'll ask the guys in the booth to provide for me tonight. Wilde's blessedly short three-act tragedy reaches its climax and conclusion. Having granted his stepdaughter her terrible wish and heard her long rhapsody to the severed head, a shaken King Herod takes leave of the stage. And I'm going to quote verbatim from both the stage directions and the language of the very end of Oscar's play. Put out the torches, hide the moon, hide the stars, let us hide ourselves in our palace, Herodias. I began to be afraid. As the slaves began to extinguish the stage flares, we hear the voice of Salome. I have kissed thy mouth, Yochanan. I have kissed thy mouth. There was the bitter taste on thy lips. Was it the taste of blood? But perchance it is the taste of love. They say that love hath a bitter taste. But what of that? What of that? I have kissed thy mouth, Yochanan. A moonbeam falls on Salome, covering her with light. Herod, turning round and seeing his stepdaughter, cries out, "Kill that woman!" The soldiers rush forward and crush beneath their shields Salome, daughter of Herodias, princess of Judea. Curtain. Well, rather more moonshine than moonbeam, but it does certainly have its own lurid frissons of decadence, and one certainly would wish to have been there on opening night, wedged tightly between Dr. Pozzi and Marcel Proust, with the Duchesse de Guermantes sitting very close by. But in fact, the Paris premiere of 1896 was not a success. Hokum is hokum even in French, even when spoken and shimmied by the divine Sarah. On the other hand, it evidently sounded better auf Deutsch. In 1901, the play had success in Breslau in a German translation by Hedwig Leichmann. In 1902-03, Wilde's play ran for 200 performances in Berlin in Max Reinhardt's production in an alternate Lachmann translation. A young Viennese writer, Anton Lindner, proposed to cut Wilde's play and turn it into a libretto for the composer Richard Strauss. By the time Strauss attended the Reinhardt production in 1903, he had already begun composing music for the opera, completing the full score in June of 1905. The first Strauss opera, Salome, the hefty Wagnerian Marie Wittig, was horrified by the music's complexity and by the role's sexual perversity. "I won't do it. I am a decent woman. After this modestly successful 1905 Dresden performance, there were 50 other productions within the next 2 years. When Gustav Mahler heard Emmy Destin sing the title role in Berlin in January of 1907, he wrote, "I am firmly convinced that it is one of the greatest masterpieces of our time. An active volcano is at work under a heap of slag, a subterranean fire, not merely a firework." But there were also censorship problems in Vienna, London, and New York. In Berlin, the Kaiser would allow a performance only if the redemptive star of Bethlehem were shown on a backcloth at the end of the performance. Nevertheless, the propulsive intensity and sophistication of Strauss's music was invincible and redeemed into greatness Wilde's potboiler play, and the thorny modernism of the music cut through Wilde's indulgent treacle. Salome's terrible and obsessively repeated cry of Johannan, let me kiss your mouth, and I have kissed thy mouth, Johannan. Ich habe deinen Mund geküsst, Johannan, haunts us, sickens us, terrifies us, finds a dark place in our deepest libido. At last, the compellingly lurid story has found its proper scale and medium. For me, Strauss's version defines the difference between the modern and the 19th century. Its complex new sonorities and ferocious lyricism cut across Wilde's old-fashioned melodrama. Strauss's musical repetitions read as Freudian psychology, as lustful obsession. The sonar vocabulary of his corrupt characters and his broken waltzes predict the terrible carnage soon to come in Europe as surely as Le Sacre de Printemps and several years earlier. The designers are aware of the Beardsley drawings that were made by the young Aubrey Beardsley. Wilde hated these illustrations for the first English edition of his play. In part, it's a younger, transgressive artist, shocking, an artist who thought he had made the last transgression. But I suspect also that Wilde thought that he was being satirized as Herod and shown as fat. Call me anything, but don't call me fat. Perhaps the most brilliant version of these Beardsley drawings came in 1923 in a wonderful, glowing silent film by the Ukrainian Jewish dancer actress Alla Nazimova. We'll show that on the evening of opera and film in a 72-minute silent film, but it was not at the time a commercial success because on the street the word that it was too gay and that there were orgies in its making. But no one does so brilliantly the arc of Salome from innocent virgin princess to old crone. That's Nazimova at the end of the 72 minutes after she's made her fatal decision. By the way, Nazimova, who was the lover of women more than men, you name them, she was their lover, was Nancy Reagan's godmother. Top that, babies. One other reverberation in the 20th century, and particularly appropriate to our location, concerns Norma Desmond of Sunset Boulevard, Billy Wilder's memorable film of 1950. If you remember, Norma Desmond, who claims to be 50, though Gloria Swanson was actually 51 when she played the part, exactly the same age of Sarah Bernhardt, is trying to create a screenplay about Salome to make her re-entry into films and her entry into the talkies. In her growing madness, she lures into her Moreau-esque mansion the down-on-his-luck writer Joe Gillis, William Holden, but meant to be the younger, gayer, more hapless Montgomery Clift, to write this screenplay. And if you look, and we're going to show this film here in the Billy Wilder Theater on some evening. You'll see it in your program, and I'm going to introduce it. You will see, instead of the sleek bath Black Panther, a chattering incontinent monkey. But it's a very, very interesting film, and you'll see that Billy Wilder, as always, knew exactly what he was doing. One last reverberation, just barely creeping into the 21st century, and it concerns Estelle Parsons' direction in New York of Al Pacino, Marissa Tomei, and David Strathorn in a dramatic reading, not surely up to Michael Hackett's forthcoming version, reviewed in the New York Times on May the 1st, 2003. I saw it there, and I also saw it brought to the Wadsworth Theater, but without Marissa Tomei. How George of Seinfeld would have been disappointed. This is Ben Brantley's review. Playing the prophet Yochanan, a.k.a. John the Baptist, Mr. David Strathorn had the pale, wild-eyed look of Bob Dylan at his most visionary and an artificially enhanced voice that could peel flesh. But the show is at its most inspired in the presentation of Herod and Salome as different sides of the same expensive coin. Ms. Tomei, a Salome in a runaway state of sexual awakening, looks lithe-bodied and luscious, and she speaks with the petulant breathiness of a 1950s starlet. Mr. Pacino, his stomach straining against his black dress shirt, looks bleary and bloated and talks in the weary, high-pitched sing-song of a man who is long accustomed to people hanging on his every word. For all their surface differences, they are both spoiled monsters, creatures of vast appetites used to getting exactly what they want. Both Herod and Salome have a habit here of letting their tongues stray out of their mouths as if in anticipation of taste to come. Blood indeed. But let us not end with Al Pacino and Marissa Tomei, tongues awry, but with Oscar Wilde and a few aphorisms for his time and ours. Friendship is far more tragic than love. It lasts longer. If one tells the truth, one is sure, sooner or later, to be found out. Any preoccupation with ideas of what is right or wrong in conduct shows an unusual, arrested intellectual development. The criminal classes are so close to us that even the policeman can see them. They are so far away from us that only the poet can understand them. Public opinion exists only where there are no ideas. Nothing that actually occurs is of the smallest importance. Thank you very much.